Live now on LinkedIn. Hello everybody. This is the second pay practitioners panel today, and we are joined by James Seachern, Justin Sun, Chad Atwell, and special guest Bryan Briscoe. And today we are going to have a casual professional conversation about, how do we think compensation is going to change in the next 5 years or so. It seems like this year we've seen in the last several months we've seen a lot of changes in technologies coming out and how they're being applied to HR. I think in the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of changes around compensation just as the labor markets moved, as post-pandemic world and during pandemic world really kind of changed the way that comp was done. And I think we'll continue to see that over the next several years. So Bryan, as our guest speaker, just would I was fortunate enough to see you earlier this week at the World at Work conference and chat as well. But you had a presentation. What was your presentation over this year?
So this year kind of talked about future-proofing compensation and those types of things. And I would say the elevator speech was, with chatbots and everything else kind of coming in, AI, a lot of stuff that we have done over the last 20 years or taken for granted is like, people work or things like there'll be steps that get automated and how do we adjust to that? And I think, there's probably a framework of how we do that. And some of what I shared was it's not going to be just about, are we competitive? Are we equitable? But how do we tell the story to like position our companies with like the right employee value proposition? How do we talk to people about their opportunities? How do we talk to people about like their growth and their financial health and how do we differentiate people? So, it's kind of this framework of these 6 different views where we've historically focused really hard in compensation about 2 of those 6, but the other 4 are kind of like what we leave out in sort of the arty space where we say, oh, like that's the art of this, or like, talk to your manager about that, or that's for the HR professionals to decide, or your HR business partner will help you with that. So I think it's how do we bring more of the science around, like as things that we've done and that you can train a computer to do. How do we do those things that bridge the gap further into the employee experience?
Yeah, I wonder too, with all the with what the computers can do and what the technology is doing. It seems like that's closing a lot of gaps. I'm, from my view, kind of, I think what compensation is going to continue to be and where our focus is going to change is really the communication and education piece. Because we can automate spreadsheets and we can use tools to write job descriptions and things like that. But people don't understand it. I think that's still a really challenging part that you still need to have that human element. It sounds like that's kind of a big focus that you're working on as well, or emphasizing.
Yeah, happy to throw this out for everybody, but one of the things that I told our leadership team in my organization is, compensation for probably, in the last 5 years, I think more has changed in the last 5 years than what changed in the prior 20 years before that all combined. And I think if you look at the legislative front, if you look at the social front, the next 3 to 5 years are going to have more changes than the last 5 years, plus the last 25 years is going to change. What we're going to see when we get together, Justin, in 2028, we're going to like laugh about, remember that time in 2023 that we were talking about like how things would evolve? Because I think about 2018, like think about where you were in 2018, where I was in 2018, the conversations that we were having within the profession about what was new and big and what was that, like everything, everything that we were talking about then, we were talking about like, what if we could, scrape data off of job postings, or what if people started posting pay ranges, or, that was like the big forward looking thing. And now that's table stakes. And, we've, people have built tools and put things out there, and it's a completely different world already, and it's only getting faster.
Yeah.
So I have a question, Brian, for the group then. Like this is kind of one of the things I was thinking about when we're thinking about how things have changed with the emergence of crowdsourced data or scrape data, what is the role of traditional survey sources? And how are those two going to coincide and work together? We're not going to get through this without talking about AI about 100 times. But is AI going to be the way that bridges those two and reconciles those two opposing forces of information? And what does that mean for traditional survey providers? And I'll just ask that question to the group. I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, from where I've seen what we, at the conference this week, we had a lot of people that came by and were asking kind of, something similar along that. It's like, how do you kind of use the data from Squirrel to kind of marry it up to your traditional surveys? And what we kind of tell folks is that, you use the surveys to set your ranges, but Squirrel and that kind of data that you can pull from the the pay range data is where you're going to pay within those ranges that you've set based on kind of what we're seeing in the markets. And I think that really helped a lot of folks kind of grasp how the two can live side by side. But I think, on top, one of the challenges that I see, or one of the things I think will be interesting too, is kind of how the legislation changes over time. There's going to be additional, Illinois as well as Hawaii are really moving towards that pay transparency model, and I think we're going to see many more states do it. There's an amendment to the FLSA being proposed to require job descriptions or job postings to include that pay range. But I think that one of the other interesting things at the same time that's happened is the safe harbor guidelines have kind of been, the safe zones, those 3 rules: 90 days old, anonymous data, managed by a third party, and more than 5 companies. The Department of Justice kind of stepped back from that and said that those aren't necessarily the safe zones anymore. Mm-hmm. So, what I think will be really interesting is how do you marry those two kind of opposing forces up when the legislation and the guidance that we've looked at for so long has kind of changed. I think that's going to be one of the really interesting things to see how that's out in the next couple of years.
So it feels like there's definitely a role for those traditional sources, but they probably need to slicken up. We're seeing like direct links to HRIS through APIs and that horrible submission process. We have to assemble all the data and reformat into an Excel file and upload it. I feel like that's some of the things that needs to evolve and change, and then certainly job matching. Leveling in particular, using automated tools to help make that a bit smoother. And again, another quite curious to think what will happen with that process of job matching. Can that ever be completely eradicated? Is there a dream world where we don't have to do any more job matching sessions, or is that always going to be room for a bit of human involvement there?
I think it's always going to have some level of discretion that needs to be done, because everybody's going to continue to have their own flavor of job architecture and their own number of levels. So you've got to kind of reconcile that. But I really do hope that there is some technology out there at some point that can take whatever sort of scrape data that's available out there and take all that job posting information, and it's not even just limiting it to the job responsibilities anymore. There's going to be a lot more skills data, as you start to get away from more of the traditional qualifications for education and those sorts of things. Like, there's going to be a lot of new criteria in those job postings that we just necessarily really haven't used a lot of for the matching process. So I really do. I hope there's some sort of master technology or something out there that helps to consolidate that, gives you like maybe just that percentage of accuracy. Like this posting matches 90 some percent compared to your roles and your levels, and then you as the administrator, the professional on that, can kind of allow some of your own discretion on top of it.
So we'll get us a chunk of the way there, but there'll always be that need. There's always that chunk of information that's in someone's mind somewhere. That right. if it's not written down anywhere, it's not going to help.
Exactly. Because as much as we're not trying to price individual people, we still know the people in a lot of cases, right? So the individual flavors of those roles.
Yeah, I would also add to that. I think each organization has their own unique talent strategy, right? So when you get a compensation survey, you have the decision as an organization to either match to a generic software engineering match, or you can match it to a mobile engineer or even an artificial intelligence engineer. And that is going to vary from one organization to another based on whatever your company's career framework and talent strategy is. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, especially as new jobs come into the market, how do companies actually match or not match to these new jobs? Because I don't think there is actually a good data source right now to see kind of what percentage of companies are matching to a particular new job or kind of maintaining their existing job matches.
Yeah, new jobs are always a problem, is that they take so long to populate with information. And if you think about like 5 years, I was thinking about how could this potentially all change, and maybe not in 5 years, maybe it'll take a little longer. But the idea of any kind of leveling, any kind of job family, is it even necessary, or is it more a case of just pulling down, like the same way you search for a vacation, like you filter down on criteria, like you'll pull down. Okay, I think I need this many years of experience. I certainly need to be able to do this. I certainly need to be able to do that. And I don't really care what you call it or what the level is, but these are the skills. To Chad's point, it's more about the skills that you need these jobs to do, and the existence of a framework was there to solve a problem. And if that problem goes away or is addressed in some capacity by AI and better information, then maybe it's just a world where we don't even need that.
Yeah, I'm curious if many organizations are moving to skills-based pay right now, to your point, James, because I'm seeing a lot of research on that being kind of the future, but I'm curious just how companies are actually putting that into practice. Because when we talk about kind of position within comp range, we always say there's multiple different factors that can affect where someone is placed within range. But as all these new market vendors like Mercer, for example, are coming out with platforms that tell you what to pay for a particular skill, I'm curious how that affects the market pricing methodology that companies use.
The skills-based pay piece, I feel, has been touted for a while, and it's never quite been cracked. So that would be interesting.
There was a session at the World at Work conference this week. It was Intel, and they had both Deloitte and Mercer and a skills vendor up there as well, essentially just talking through how they're adopting skills. I think it's going to continue to be really heavily focused on how do you give people more opportunities from a development perspective. But at some point there is going to be, well, you moved into these different roles, you acquired these different skills, and that ultimately allowed you to earn more, or even just take on maybe some additional responsibilities. Maybe you became a part-time person on a particular project or something, and that allowed you to take on new skills and also earn a little extra money, and sort of the fractured HR, fractured position sort of model that way.
I think if I was just gonna skills-based pay, I think there was a big wave of that in the 90s, and people sat in rooms and talked through point factor systems, which is really kind of the same thing. If you we've been digging into that from a data standpoint, and I think when you look at IT jobs, where there's a definable technical skill, either you can do something or you can't. The biggest problem with skills pay, trying to administer it practically as a practitioner, is everyone has Excel skills. How do you rank order those people and tell them that they're, the master guru? What's the difference between an Excel Jedi and the person that's I can look at that, row of numbers and type it into a calculator and give you a sum off of that. Those people, if you take the Dunning-Kruger effect for those that like Wikipedia, the people that aren't very good at it still think they're really good at it. And the people that are great at it are usually a little more humble than what their actual status is. And so how do you rank those skills, and how do you have those hard conversations if you're going to link that to pay, to tell somebody turns out you're not that great at whatever it is? I think that's where we can work through a theoretical framework, but managers, HR leaders, people ready to have those conversations to say, this is where you fall, and is that skill necessary to your job? I also put it as, if I'm great at doing basket weaving, my leader is probably not going to be like, hey, we'll give you a premium for that basket weaving thing, because that has nothing to do with my job. But that conversation gets harder in other places. So I think that's rubber meets the road That's one of the biggest challenges there. It's not can we mine data to see if skills have different values. It's how do you actually apply that in your organization?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if y'all have heard of the term of micro credentials, but I think a lot of organizations, big tech companies like Meta and Google, they have their own kind of micro credentials right now for different subject matter areas like user experience or cybersecurity. And this is what we expect somebody in this particular role to do and to qualify as being proficient. And it'll be interesting, I think, to see with all these certifications that come out, similar to how when you bring college grads into your organization, you pay them all kind of a standard rate. Will companies want to do the same with these micro credentials, where there's kind of that standard, universally aligned definition of what someone is proficient in? So yeah, and I think a lot of companies are more likely to hire folks who've had kind of that industry micro credential from a lot of the research that I've come across.
I smiled when you said that, Justin, but only because I feel like there's a trend for putting the word micro in front of a lot of very old concepts we've made. It does make sense, but yeah.
It's interesting too, and I think if you go back to the people piece of it, sure. I mean, we may have these skills and may be able to do the things, but how well can you execute on those skills? And that's really, I mean, kind of Bryan, what you were saying, where the rubber meets the road. How often are you executing on them? Can you execute them effectively? Just because you know how to do it, and you could do it, if you can't translate that to kind of how it supports the business and get that kind of buy-in and persuade leadership that this is the right approach, those skills may be great, but they may not have a true business impact. I mean, it depends on the role, of course, but I think that's also one of the really important things to consider is because you can do it doesn't mean you're doing it effectively. Does it mean you're doing it in line with, the company's philosophies and company's principles? And I think that's, I see a lot of kind of the comments that are talking about the qualitative and the subjective aspect of, skill-based, but how do you actually quantify those things? And that's a challenge. What vendors have you guys seen in terms of, I think that there's some other comments happening in the chat in terms of companies that are using tools for skill-based pay to kind of assess the pay. I saw Foot Partners come through. I believe Mercer has a skills library as well. Have anyone on the panel used any or familiar with any of the other skill-based tools that help to kind of comp?
I have not personally in my experience, but I know I've came across an organization called Eightfold recently, which is an artificial intelligence platform where they can assess all of the skills that your employees have internally. And then based on an opening or particular need that a team might have, you can identify what existing skills you might be able to leverage from another team. So you could potentially create like a gig, for example, a short-term assignment where you have a specific project that you need done, but you don't necessarily want to go out and hire an entirely new headcount. And you can just leverage the existing talent that you have. It's more cost efficient for the business. It allows for greater employee development internally. And it's much easier from an onboarding perspective, and you get faster results. So that was something interesting that I came across with Eightfold. And I've also heard about some companies experimenting with position kind of auto assigning increases during their salary increase cycle based on specific skills that employees possess and what the organization thinks are critical skills. So you kind of have a machine that's auto assigning and kind of trying to take out that manager bias from the review process, because we all know that is easily introduced when you don't have clear systematic or formulaic guidelines around how to determine pay. So I think there's still going to be a human element that's needed here, I think is what a lot of us have said. But I think the tools are making it much easier to amalgamate all the available data you have and again, try to remove as much of that bias as possible.
Yeah.
So I've looked at, a number of vendors. I saw a couple of people in chat, I think all of the big survey houses have some kind of skills solution at this point that's out there, whether you're talking about WTW or Aon or Mercer or Korn Ferry or anybody in that group. Like we've taken the approach like I have a sort of a data intensive wing of my team, and we've taken the approach of, trying to understand this for ourselves first before either investing a bunch of money. So we've, the tricky part about skills is they're all relative, and that's the thing that I'm looking for in tools is, like if you take IT jobs are naturally sort of skill based and like almost what defines them as being different. But like the skill around like an IT security certification within somebody that's applying for an IT security job has a different premium than the skill for IT security for somebody that's doing general cloud computing, for example, right? Like sometimes the skill is a table stake in one context. And it's, like if you're hiring a communications person, like the ability to write well is an assumption. If you're hiring a compensation person, the ability to write well might make them a magical unicorn. Speaking for, sort of in my own self-deprecating way. I think that figuring out how those go together in these sort of like calculators where people want to sort of make this linear block, the skills don't build like Legos. They build more like a neural network, right? If you think about that, like it's those, how do you build those sort of unicorn or purple squirrel jobs, as the recruiters like to think about it? Like those are often a different need. Like it's not this sort of like stack up, this skill is worth $5,000, this is worth that. So I think and we're seeing that as we look through the data and sort of mine it and look at it. And so I think as people put solutions together, I think that's going to evolve over time. I still think it's going to be very hard for companies to like enumerate. The other side of this is that data only gets really good if you sort of enumerate all of the things that somebody does in a job. And I don't know many companies where like that little phrase "and other duties as needed" is kind of like your big loophole of the black hole of what's not in your, linear regression as you're taking those things apart. So that would just be my like 2 cents of, again, where I'm like, I really want to be in that space, but I think the usage of it is still limited.
Yeah.
It was a great conversation.
Yeah. I'd like to kind of throw out there maybe a little bit of a different direction, but it was one of the comments that came up. It is a little bit more like, how do we offer more flexibility? I think it fits in to this idea of, Bryan, you kicked us off really talking about the employee experience. And it feels like to me, as somebody who's been working with these comp tools for quite some time, is that we're actively getting away from the manager and some of the leaders as being like the main users of those tools and starting to put more tools into the hands of the employees. And, is that really something that we think the 5 years from now, employees will be running the show or kind of making their own decisions as far as some of the different kinds of compensation that they want to have, being able to make trade-offs and, go for, stock versus cash and some of those things, as opposed to a manager who's kind of sitting there evaluating performance and kind of making those recommendations on salary increases? Do we feel like maybe employees might be in the driver's seat a little bit more on that?
Yeah. I feel like there's been a big focus on that. I think correct me if I'm wrong if you guys have seen this, but I believe Shopify is one of those companies that gives you a really, you can go in and pull the different levers that you want to kind of customize your own rewards package. I love that as an employee experience. As a compensation practitioner, I would be terrified at managing something like that. That seems like a lot of challenges to, when you're looking at, how do you look at internal equity, up years, down years, high stock prices, low stock prices. I mean, it's a really fantastic approach for the employee experience. But I wonder too, do we need to have kind of additional technologies come into place before we can actually begin to offer things like that, so those can be more managed? I think tools like Syndios, where they look at the pay equity on an ongoing basis, or those that could certainly help with some of those concerns. But I haven't seen a lot of technologies, and I would imagine it's going to take those technologies to improve and increase before we can really kind of start seeing that offered at the same level of frequency that you see maybe just like a short-term incentive plan offered.
Yeah, I think so. So Brian mentioned a point earlier about the play experience and thinking more broadly. So that's what Total Rewards kind of was meant to be 30 odd years ago when it was first touted, and it's kind of evolved to just mean comp and bends, which disappoints me immensely because the whole point was to say, well, your comp and your bends is the hygiene factor. That's your table set, something you need to get right. But for the most part, it's not a hugely motivating component of most people's lives. And the concept of Total Rewards say, well, let's focus more on the value and think and invest more in the other aspects that make people enjoy the work, the careers and the compensation, which by the way is one of my criticisms of skills-based pay, is it kind of ignores people's will to learn. It looks focused on what people can do and have done and have proven themselves to be able to do, not what their interests are in the future. But if we do start focusing on Total Rewards again, as I think we should, and many good companies do this and think much more carefully about it, then optionality, I do think, is a important thing. And if we just narrow in on cash and equity, I just want to. So I totally agree. The administration can be a nightmare, and this is a platform out there that can just automate the whole thing. And Netflix does this as well. As recently Shopify, but it does get administratively complicated. And the other aspect is, does anyone really understand when they're making these choices, like when they're choosing between an option, an RSU, and cash, and they're looking at the conversion factor that Netflix came up with to convert an option to an RSU, and did they really understand the risk reward profile that's going on there? I kind of feel that's a lawsuit waiting to happen when someone realizes that they weren't saving enough because they didn't really understand what they were sacrificing. So there's a whole load of challenges, but I feel like greater employee understanding of the full Total Rewards equation plus systems, and we're talking about the next 5 years, right? Certainly over the next 5 years, I think we'll see more of them.
I was trying to think if I've seen any other companies that have really kind of moved towards that. But I think, to your point, the lawsuit is when I continue to hear this kind of throughout the conversations, is when someone didn't understand, and it still kind of continues to go back to that education piece, which I think, I really do think that as we continue to see these technologies improve, kind of what we're doing to, calculate a formula or write a job description or, those simple things, the compensation function is going to continue to really be heavily focused on the communication piece and the education piece. All the companies I've ever worked for that had a really strong education program or manager training program for compensation have been the ones that had the greatest buy-in from employees and the greatest kind of compensation satisfaction because people understand how they were paid. I don't see that going away.
I think, if I was just going to maybe shift, build on that topic, Justin, I think, the next 5 years, what's going to happen. And James kind of set this up perfectly of like, we all had the goal. I didn't have the goal 30 years ago because I was in middle school, but, I was trying to like learn how to shave or something, which I still haven't done. But what I would say is like, there's this goal of Total Rewards. And what do we do? I think with like the legal environment, with like the focus on transparency, with the focus on pay equity being there, what's going to happen is we've talked about, like, you think about even the words we use, like salary structures. Like we've been talking about frameworks and boxes. We've been building structures that are frameworks, but we have not been putting in necessarily drywall or windows or brass doorknobs. And what I mean by that is, very few companies can you go in and say, this is how much experience I have. These are the skills that I bring to the table. This is what I've done. And then that company can turn around and be like, oh, we're going to offer you exactly X. Like, these are the things that, how do we put that together, right? Like, how do we say, even if it's not a formula, how do we get really close with those things? So I think over the next couple of years, as a comp professional, before I go to like the choose whether you want RSUs or stock, I've got to get to we're going to start narrowing in our salary ranges. We're going to start understanding how people are paid in a job. If I've got 100 people that do the same job and they all make different rates, I've got 10,000 points of connection to say, like why is this person paid differently than this person? I think being able to answer those questions is going to be the thing that's going to force us to be better, and maybe be the thing that we all aspire to, or the thing, I would say it's the thing that my mom thinks that I do for a living, but she still thinks like I do communications or something like that. Because she asked me that the other day. She was like, "You're like the VP of what?" And it's like something in HR, right? And I was like, "It's compensation." She's like, "Oh, that was communications." But on a good day, if we can like aspire to like what does it do? Like, how do we offer equitable, fair offers and do those things? There's a lot of room for us to get better at that as a profession, I think. I mean, there's probably a company out there that has like, when you come work here, here's the formula. But I don't see that in a lot of large companies. I don't see that like widespread. And I'm not saying that formulas are all the answers, but I think there's something more robust and more thoughtful that's going to come about. Reactions, maybe you guys can think off base, but
I mean, compensation is communication, Brian. I mean, that's what I've been told my entire career. So yeah, I mean, I think you're both. You're both for sure.
One of the questions in the chat was actually how a comp range is going to change, which I think you're touching on, Brian. And one of the things I point is it even worth having ranges? Like, what's the point, really? Like, so ranges allow for discretion, which provides opportunity for inherent bias, which is why we have all this pay transparency legislation in the first place to address for those failings. So if we have confidence in the pay level and we have attributes that define pay, are we going to get to a world where we just pay people what the computer says we're going to pay them, or we just pay people at points like in a classic government style organization, remove that discretion, know that it's fair, know that it is just, and know that it's transparent, and just get away from this idea? And then that's going to force you to take a much longer term view of career and reward, because no longer can you get rewarded through a merit cycle. Not that that was meaningful anyway, but the real rewards come through promotions, which they always were the real source of meaningful pay opportunities anyway. But you reinforce to employees then you're paid this rate because you do this job the same as everyone else doing this job. But if you really want to create more personal wealth creation and career opportunity, you need to focus on your career, which is the motivating factor in the total rewards equation. So it plays into this idea of embracing total rewards, and it solves to a large degree any pay equity issues. And it removes that inherent bias in the process of managers making discretionary decisions around pay.
The problem I see with kind of moving towards removing that discretion piece is there is always going to be that human input piece, whether it is a performance review, because there is that discretionary piece of when you are assessing kind of someone's performance. You can't, unless it's kind of like those like a worker where you are measuring on a piecemeal performance, especially the professional level roles. There's always going to be that human element, and there's always going to be the potential for bias that needs to go into that. So making sure that you can test those and kind of mitigate challenges towards that bias that move away from, or that move into the equation. I think that's going to be one of the bigger challenges, and kind of why there's always got to be that human element. Because it's there from the very beginning, and it's hard to remove. I mean, I've seen this many times when you, even reading a job description that someone writes, while it's intended to mean one thing, it oftentimes did not make it from the mind of what that person wanted it to be to what was actually on the paper. So I don't know how you could fully remove, or if you should remove kind of that human element. I mean, maybe narrowing the bands. I think really if you are able to create a defensible and consistent process, that's the most important piece, and kind of narrowing down those guardrails is a big help. But I mean, I think that there are tools that will continue to come out there that help kind of establish those guardrails, but I would be scared to remove kind of all that discretion piece. And I don't think I don't think anyone suggested that we would do that, but it's certainly one of the things that Brian, I'm sure that you've seen it too, when we're developing kind of like merit formulas and kind of recommendations for X, Y, and Z. I mean, here's a formula, but maybe we go between here and here to keep that discretion, but create a standardized approach to create the initial recommendation.
I mean, I think, to that point on like how much discretion will still be left. I see comments and a few things in the chat coming through about, the ranges are going to get narrower and narrower. I certainly believe, I would bet money that ranges are going to get narrower, whether they're in fact published narrower, But I think the driving factor is going to be like, if you look at like the EU pay transparency rules, where they say like you've got to be able to explain anything greater than a 5% gap. Well, like that 5% gap is going to be, a plus or minus 2.5% room of discretion. And I think as companies, as you face different, legal risk and those types of things will put some type of real collar around how much discretion businesses are willing to actually put out there. We'll all do a lot of things until, somebody faces like a major lawsuit, a payout, or those types of things. And then, we'll decide like, hey, we're going to be within plus or minus 2.5% because there's only a 5% margin of error that's allowed in a certain place. I think that's what's going to evolve over time. And then, the question gets to be, if I'm at plus or minus 2.5%, why am I fighting over the difference between, 99,000 euros and 101,000 euros? Do I just do a formula and call it a day and tell people this is how we pay? I think that's how it's going to evolve,
Well, and Brian, when you say that, so you ran a poll this week. Was it this week or last week about
last
how?
week.
Yeah, and I thought that was such a tell everyone that might have missed it. What was your poll? What were the results? And
so the poll, and I should have pulled that up before we got on here, but so the question was something like, in a perfectly transparent world where you can see what everybody else makes, would you rather? I think it was A, make 115,000, whatever, call it dollars, euros, baht, whatever you want to make. Would you rather make 115,000 while everybody else makes 125? Would you rather make 115 while everybody else makes 105? Or would you rather make 110 and everybody else makes 110? Everybody makes 110. So like where everybody's equal, we actually put the number lower. But in the first two cases, you're making the same amount of money, but do you want to be the highest paid in the group, or do you want to be the lowest paid in the group or the highest paid in the group? Interestingly enough, about a third of people wanted to be the highest paid. About a sixth of people wanted to be the lowest paid in the group. And the other half, a full 50%, just wanted everybody to be paid equal. And it was probably a bunch of people that are, answering these polls, because we're all comp people when I look at the end of that. Kind of my joke on that is like half of us are tired of dealing about the whining between $5,000 or $10,000 here or there. But it was an interesting thing, because here's what got me. The more people, and some of you may be here on screen and some of you may be in the chat that I can see names. Like I got more private messages about this poll than any other post that I've ever done, where people are like, I chose this answer and everybody in every other answer is an idiot or a narcissist or a terrible person. Not only did people like passionately pick about those, but they were like, if you picked in the other category, you're basically stupid or amoral or immoral or something to that effect. And it was pretty fascinating, the discussions that came out of that. But so like I chose the group of like my sincere answer to that would be, I would want to be the lowest paid. Like I would want to be in the 115 to 125 group, partly because I go like, well, at some point there's going to be a reversion to the mean. Somebody's going to bump me up. I'm going to get back to 125. Also, I don't want to be the high, like if everybody can see everything, I don't really want to walk into every meeting with people going like, why does he make more than me? Like it's more fun to be like, why did the rest of, it's better to have that like leverage if you're just like pure, playing pure social capital. That was the least popular answer of all of those. I'm not saying that it was right, but that would have been like my bias. Fascinating. Like the group that was the most passionate was the group that was like, we want to make 115 while everybody else makes 105. And they're like, because, it's basically like, you got to be a winner. Like, I had friends messaging me being like, do you not want to win? Like, I want to be in first place. And there's more to it than that, right? Like, but people wanted that reinforcement, and some of you, different people put different things for that. But I would say what was amazing was the biggest group that all said we want to be equal. Very diverse group of people, like geographically outside of the U.S. That was an overwhelmingly positive answer. More than 50% of people there. The population Like I would say, if you were a woman, you answered much more likely in the group that I answered, which is like I would rather be lower than my peers, or I'd rather be in the all equal than in the other group. And I think if you think about some of the pay gap things that have happened, like some of it is like who's benefited from these sort of self-perpetuating things. So if you had a big title and you were, male and an American and Caucasian, you probably wanted that. People that look like me or more often chose that second option of wanting to be the highest paid. Again, it wasn't me, but like that was how the demographics kind of broke out, and it it raises a lot of questions of like how are we entertain. Of course, this is a small sample, but I think we've seen this data play out in a lot of different ways. So just to make it all awkward, like there's a whole bunch of different social worldviews that play into this. And like, what do people expect is normal, and what do people think is good, and like, what are people passionate about? I did not expect quite the response that I got from that. Not even about volume, but just the passion around the question.
I think a related comment on this is we all agree that there's probably more convergence around pay, and if you do that, how do you reward people? So to Bryan, your point, those people that want to be winners, well, one, they might already be salespeople and they're on a commission plan, so that they're taken care of, right? But they can win on their commissions. But for everyone else, if we're converging pay and there's less room for differentiation through merit and distribution of the bands, what levers are left to reward for performance and link pay to performance? Because pay for performance and pay equity kind of pull in different directions. And I suppose we still got equity, of course. Like equity is a great long-term vehicle, but it's really pay for group performance because that's company performance. And I kind of circle back to the point I made earlier, which is, well, it's really career. That's really the reward for high performance. It's the most meaningful reward you can offer, and it's the most motivating. So I think if you're kind of taking away those short-term levers, then it really becomes long-term rewards for your high performance. But I guess to summarize, how does that reconcile? If we start to focus more on pay equity, where's the room left for performance?
I think how well you do pay equity is really contingent too on how strong are your performance management processes too, right? Because every company has a different level of rigor when it comes to calibrations and comparing how one population was rated versus another population with the same job type. And I think the majority of organizations that I've talked to that do kind of the pay equity piece, they will get the results back from a platform like Syndio, for example, but then they will still have kind of a human element of reviewing what the results are, especially I think because pay is personal, so we want to make sure that the results that we get from this machine are have a human lens put on it, and so I think the majority of organizations that I've seen want to evaluate the results of a platform like Syndio because maybe they aren't sure if an employee was rated appropriately in a certain way, and especially if you include performance as part of your pay equity methodology, you want to make sure and be confident that there was justice done by that individual during the performance review process. So I think kind of how you do pay equity is and whether you're a pay for performance organization, because some companies don't have performance ratings, is you have to think about how performance ratings fits into that methodology.
And a good comment in there that equity and equality are not the same thing, of course. So that which does create that room for performance to be that consideration, as long as it's done in a fair and unbiased way.
I think that's maybe even one of the cruxes of our profession. And I'm looking, there's a lot of chat coming through of people talking about the difference between equality and equity and those types of things. I think equity is that, under the same circumstances, two people would be paid the same, realizing that like you might have an organization where no two people are under the same circumstances, right? So, equality of outcome may not be the the same for different people, because they do have different, whether it's geographic differentials or if there's any kind of tenure or performance-based pay. But I think if you look, Goldman Sachs just had a big settlement of about, I think it was like $215 million or something. And I don't know anybody at Goldman Sachs, but I feel like that's not a company that like didn't have an HR department. I feel like they've, a few of us have heard of who they are, and I have no inside pool to this. And the case actually goes back to like the early 2000s, late 90s. But one of their things was they had a huge settlement on gender bias, not because, major cases of it, if you read into the settlement, were because the opportunities that women were given did not match up to men. So like, because a lot of people will say, well, like a sales plan, it's whatever I get against that. Well, if people are given different sales territories, if there's an unconscious bias where you say, I give a certain group of people not these types of accounts or not these types of sales, or, if you have organizations where sales leaders go like, well, that client wouldn't want to work with a woman or a person of color or something, terrible things that we would like not acknowledge should be said in a open environment. But like, if those things happen, they can result in people having less opportunity and having those types of things that will show up in your data over the long run, right? Like those are things that we have to watch for. So when you think about equity, it is that access to the opportunity, it's that access to how decisions are made. Most of us would not think that if you went into an organization and people in any one group were all poor performers and people in another group were all great performers. I think making sure that we're evaluating things and systems that way is this, that sometimes gets missed on leaders who go like, well, if we have goals and everybody has the same bonus plan and they just have goals for that or that type of thing. Remembering those types of things is going to be important. And if you look at the regulations that are coming out, I think it's going to be even more important that we can explain those and make sure that those differences are noted of how, in sales, how accounts or territories are distributed and those types of things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I'm just saying that
almost
a $200 million settlement is not something that most of us want to like have to explain due to our conflict.
exactly.
And that's why it's genuine business risk. Sorry, Chad, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say there's a couple of other well-known organizations that have had a hard time with not just pay equity for employees, but also this idea of like pay parity between employees and temp workers and that sort of thing. And I feel like just kind of getting back to like what's going to happen over the next 5 years, this will continue to evolve. And I think there's just a broader like HR trend here where HR teams will start to become increasingly more responsible, not just for the employee workforce, but like the total workforce. How do we get more contractors, gig workers, temp workers, get all of the above sort of under the umbrella of an HR system that allows you to sort of effectively manage the kind of work that needs to get done, regardless of whether that's a full-time role, a temporary role, something that we need to have a contractor come in and fix immediately. And just being able to pull all of those levers at the same time will just expand the scope. It's just going to increase the size of the umbrella where we start to see everything from a pay equity perspective. But, there's, I don't know, dozens of what we call the equal treatment countries that are out there that really do look closely at employee versus temp workers and those sorts of things. So those regulations already exist. U.S. is not one of those, but, over time, we'll see kind of how that changes.
Yeah, I think, when we talk about pay equity, employees' perception of fairness is a big part of this. I think a lot of times why you see these lawsuits come out is employees don't feel like they were paid fairly. And, I wonder how much of it has to do with the level of education that those employees received about why they're paid what they're paid, or if they felt like the performance rating that they received was fair and appropriate. And I think if you think about the generations that are coming to the workplace, especially with Generation Z, they are expecting a lot more pay transparency and education than ever before, as well as stronger job descriptions. So there was an interesting study I came across a few days ago was by Simplicity, which is kind of a student experience platform. But yeah, they were saying that clear job descriptions and role expectations for employees is going to be even more important in the future, because employees want to know what are they accountable for, how can they affect their performance, and how can they affect their pay. So the crisper I think that organizations can be with defining what those expectations are across all those different populations you've mentioned, Chad, I think is going to be really helpful and important.
To your first point, Justin, as well, employees need to understand their pay. They don't necessarily need to be happy about their pay. Like a new grad is not going to be ecstatic about their pay package, but as long as they can understand it, that's the bit that makes it fair. And those are two different things. And I think you came back to the point that we keep coming back to. It's the role of the manager. Higher quality managers, pay equity alone are required to be able to have these conversations. And we talk about the fairness of performance and using pay for performance in a fair way. That means it needs to be very well trained and very skilled, be able to deliver bad news, be able to explain why someone got 2% and not just blame it on HR. This is the real skill set. And when you look at the stats around how damaging poor managers can be to morale and productivity, again, it's not just a nice thing to do. It's just a good investment of time. It's a good investment of resources to get the most out of that level of people managers. And I feel like as comp and HR professionals, we've been singing this tune for quite a long time. And there are many companies that do focus quite heavily on the role of the manager, but many companies fall down, or particularly in the startup world, they go from a world where the founders can be up there in front of a team of a few people and send the message and get everyone on board, to a world where they're relying on a new generation of people managers to spread that message. And that's a lot of where the problems arise in growing companies.
And I think too, as we continue to see that pay transparency efforts grow, what I've seen from just personal experience is the more eyes you have on compensation packages, the better the decisions that we as compensation people make. And so while it can be a scary transition, especially the leadership team or kind of management that have had a fairly loose approach or kind of loose enforcement of compensation, I think I have seen dramatic improvements just for a company overall when they have moved towards that more transparent approach. I'd say probably one of the most equitable companies out there is probably Buffer, because they post everybody's salary. Everybody has full transparency to everybody's salary, as well as kind of the external market. Buffer.com, if you look for their salaries, you can see what everyone's paid. I haven't seen that really catch on with many other companies in the private sector do that, but it's an interesting experiment, and it really does probably help to ensure that the decisions that are being made are very deliberate and very calculated, because they need to be defensible, because everybody at the company has eyes on everyone else's salaries.
Yeah, I think even more so in the EU, as Bryan was mentioning earlier, with the pay transparency directive. In the future, not only are employers going to be expected to share the pay range and starting pay for a particular role, but they're going to need to share the internal pay statistics by gender for that job. And so we're not even thinking about that from a US perspective. And it's a lot of the companies that we work for are global in nature. We have managers who are managing across multiple countries. And so how do you make sure that you are implementing programs and processes that allow managers to communicate and explain the rationale behind these statistics in a sustainable and scalable manner across, however many number of countries they manage across, will be really interesting. So I think that the EU is definitely leading in this space, and I think we're just at kind of the starting line, I feel, in terms of getting our ranges into our postings. But transparency is not for us whether we're ready or not. So.
There's a really good study, which I'm sure we can find a link for, by the European Commission. It goes back a few years, which is the impetus behind a lot of the EU's legislation, the how and the why of what they're doing. And one of the figures that stood out to me was there was $14 billion a year on the table just by getting paid fair. And that's purely through incentives, underutilized portions of the workforce, women and people of color, and reduced working hours among the same demographics. And so if you're looking for the arguments as to why we should be doing this, even if you're not aligned on the morality of it with leaders or the right way to do it, there is a really solid economic argument there for doing this stuff. I thought that was really interesting. I'll try and find a link and post it to the chat afterwards.
I I think that perspective is great too. And you know, Justin gave the example of, or Justin Hampton did, of, you know, companies that are publishing their whole, you know, like being transparent about everybody's salary. And, you know, do you put it in the spreadsheet online or on the company intranet or whatever? Even if we're not doing that, this is the challenge, and this is the conversation that I often have when I find myself in a sticky situation with either my own comp team or somebody. Like when we're making our pay decisions within a company, if you hold yourself to the standard of what if everybody could see this choice? Like, what if everybody saw, like, as I'm going to price this, and I have this conversation with my recruiting partners, I have this conversation with my HR partners. You know, not too often, but like when we get into a situation, is go, like, what would happen in our organization if we knew this decision or this option that we were considering or whatever it is? What if that was just published for everybody to see? You know, what are these compromises? What are these signing bonuses? What are these, you know, special awards? How does this look? Those are questions that I think, you know, that would just be my pro tip, to ask that question if you're a comp person struggling working through things with your partners, of how, you know, and how you're doing your own job. And if you think about the future, because we very well may be in the place. I mean, you know, right now your lawyers might say, well, if we get subpoenaed, we could have to share that. But like, what if we really have to put everything out there, and you have to disclose it? And a lot of, you know, there are a lot of comp professionals that have worked in, you know, state and federal agencies and different groups that you can go see their, you know, you can see the whole salary scale online. It's not impossible to work in that environment. You know, you can debate the merits of it, and you know, there's a whole thing there. But if we hold ourselves to sort of like that ethical standard, that sort of changes the game, but it also helps a lot.
Yeah. Well, great. We're coming up on about, you know, a couple of minutes left. So I just want to go around and see if there's any closing remarks from everybody, as we kind of, you know, spent the last 57 minutes talking about how comp will move and then how comp will change in the next 5 years. Closing remarks. James, do you want to go first?
I say comp has historically been a relatively slow-moving industry. I know things have picked up a bit in the last years. I wouldn't expect that much. You know, I'm sure AI will reduce some of the time we spend on certain things and will start playing a role. But we've had salary ranges for the best part of a century, and we probably still will in 5 years' time. I think it's just about, if we think about how we can positively change things, it's incremental improvements, you know, trying to address pay equity and trying to make life a little bit easier for, you know, the poor folks that work behind the scenes, and trying to make everyone's pay fair and meaningful.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, there was again at the World at Work conference, there was a session on how to use ChatGPT to essentially learn how to do things. And I think we haven't talked at all about just the profession and how people starting out in the profession even understand how to build a salary structure, how to do market data, you know, any of those things. You know, there was a really interesting session on just talking to ChatGPT and like, how do I do this? And how do I do, what if I have to do that? And just, it was a really interesting sort of perspective, especially being a World at Work conference, sort of like, where does our education come from in the future? And, you know, going back to like, how do you certify whether someone has a skill or not? Does the certification continue to be really important? You know, just like lots of different things on how we continue to push that profession forward on that.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think there's just so much data coming into our field now, whether it's, you know, applicant tracking systems, data that, you know, companies are now sharing on a real-time basis, or platforms like Blind, or even TikTok, you know, where employees are making videos about how they're paid, what they're paid, and what you should negotiate for. I think communication is going to be more critical than it ever has been in terms of explaining the why and defining the why specifically for your company's, you know, comp philosophy and strategy, and making it authentic. So that's, I think, what our big role will be in the next 5 years is really managing the message. Because if you don't create your own, if you don't get in front of the message, someone's going to tell that story for you.
So my last remark is, I'll say that I think my mom and Chad Atwell are right. Comp is communications, and that's going to be the big evolution of how do we talk to our employees, our associates, our partners, however you think of them, how we share more information coherently and transparently with them is probably going to be the biggest thing that's going to change over the next 5 years.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, guys, really appreciate the time that you guys took this hour for both. Bryan, thanks for joining us this week. And then thanks to everybody else that was able to join. James, Justin, Chad, appreciate the time and insights as well. And we will be back in another 2 weeks on September 30th at the same time to do another pay practitioners panel. So we will get that posted here shortly and look towards it. Well, thanks everybody, and have a great Friday and a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone. Bye.